Catherine Day, and to get an introduction to the work that you are about to embark on. I'm delighted to have been invited to moderate proceedings today. So without further ado, let me introduce the Chairperson of the Assembly. Dr. Catherine Day is a former Secretary General of the European Commission, a post she held from 2005 to 2015. Fun fact, she was the first woman ever to hold that post, and prior to her appointment as Secretary General, she was the Director General for Environment. Catherine chairs the governing body of the University College Cork and is on the board of the European Movement Ireland and the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin. She was a special advisor to the former President of the European Commission, Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, up until just last December. With her extensive experience and distinguished career, Catherine is, I think we can all agree, an excellent choice to chair this new Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality. And I'll now invite Catherine to the podium for her opening address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Katie. I'd like, on my behalf as well, also to add a very warm welcome to each and every one of you to the opening of the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality. As you've just heard, my name is Catherine Day, and I will have the honour and the privilege of chairing our meetings. I want to start by thanking you for agreeing to take part in the Assembly. You'll be doing a valuable public service by giving your time and by sharing your views. You've committed to devote a significant amount of time to the Assembly, giving up several weekends over the coming months, and we really do appreciate that commitment and that involvement. Being part of this Assembly is an exciting opportunity to be informed, but most of all to make your views heard. And your views will matter. We will be making recommendations to the Dáil and the Seanad, and the Government has committed to providing a response to each of our recommendations. So now that we're here and we're ready to start work, how will we go about advancing gender equality in Ireland? Gender affects every aspect of our lives, from the moment we are born until, hopefully, we reach old age. Gender has important impacts on the quality of our lives, on the choices that we are free to make, or that are predetermined for us by society. And gender can be the reason behind barriers and constraints that need to be examined. We all know that the social landscape of Ireland has changed in recent decades. It changed when we joined the European Union. It changed when we opened up to the wider world. It changed again with the arrival of the internet and globalization. And over time, pressures for change have brought about significant decisions. For example, bringing in equal pay, getting rid of the marriage bar, providing access to contraception, divorce and abortion, and ensuring marriage equality. And we will hear more about recent social changes in Ireland in a few minutes from Dr. Evelyn Mahon. Now, depending on how old we are, but everyone in this room has lived through these changes. Some of you may have campaigned for and supported them, and some of you may have opposed and voted against them. You each have your own experience and your own reasons. You have your own story to tell. You also have wishes for the future, for yourselves, for your families, for your communities, and for our country. And of course, there is a history to why are we here today in Dublin Castle, launching a Citizens' Assembly on advancing gender equality. And we will be part of that history. We will be making the next steps on a journey that goes back to the promise of equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens that was announced in the 1916 proclamation. We will be looking at parts of our 1937 Constitution and discussing whether or not they should be changed. We will be discussing public policy, representations of women and men in the worlds of work and in the sphere of care, participation in public life, and sharing responsibility in our home lives. And these are issues that concern and affect all of us. I find it interesting that in this same room in 2012, a constitutional convention began to examine certain issues in our constitution. And these included asking citizens to look at the role of women in two ways. First, by considering amending the wording in our constitution on women in the home and encouraging greater participation of women in public life. And second, increasing the participation of women in politics, and we're right in the middle of an election campaign at the moment. The Convention made recommendations that I'm sure we will come back to in the course of our discussions. On the issue of the wording of the Constitution on women in the home, rather than moving directly to holding a referendum on changing the Constitution, the government decided to hold this Citizens' Assembly on a broader range of gender equality issues. And that's why, in the summer of last year, the Dáil and the Seanad adopted the resolution that will guide our work. In the packs that you received coming here today, you all have received a copy of it, and I have no doubt that we will regularly refer to it in the course of our work, if only to make sure that we are meeting the expectation of the Oireachtas. Today, I want to just summarise what the Oireachtas has asked us to do, and that is three things: to advance gender equality by making proposals on a range of issues, to prioritise those issues, which may include policy, legislative, or even constitutional change, and we're asked to do these two things while having regard to the legal requirements and the costs versus the potential impact of these proposals. If you've had a chance to look already at the resolution, you'll have seen that the issues set out by the TDs and senators cover a wide range, from challenging the barriers and social ways of behaving that facilitate gender discrimination, to reassessing the economic value that is placed on work traditionally done by women, to looking at where responsibility for care lies, especially within the family, and also assessing early years parental care and facilitating greater work balance, and finally, scrutinising the structural pay inequalities that result in women being disproportionately represented in low-pay sectors. I'm sure some may feel that this assembly will be about women's issues, and it certainly will be. But gender equality equally affects and involves men and the LGBT+ community, and our debates will be inclusive. We will only succeed in advancing gender equality if everyone engages. What we're going to be doing over the next 6 months is what political scientists call deliberative democracy. This means citizens exchanging arguments and considering different perspectives on strategies that are designed to secure the public good. And in our case, the public good is advancing gender equality. Through conversations, citizens can come to an agreement about what procedures, actions, and policies will best produce that desired public good. Now, deliberative democracy is not based on a competition between conflicting interests, but it is based on an exchange of information and evidence supporting different perspectives, so that at the end of the process, citizens should be swayed by the force of the better argument, rather than private concerns or biases. Jürgen Habermas, one of the leading philosophers of our time and a founding scholar of deliberative democracy, argues that political debate, structured around fair procedures, characterized by clear and inclusive communication, and informed by relevant information and expert evidence, makes consensual and enlightened public decision-making more likely. It also makes such decision-making more democratically legitimate. And as you probably know, Ireland has had very successful examples of this way of understanding what we, the citizens, really think, and this has led to shaping new directions. In fact, previous assemblies have been so successful that there's now considerable international interest in understanding how the process worked and how it led to 2 different referendums. And I say different because the issues before each assembly are different each time, and so the outcomes will also vary. However, we will be part of building up a history and practice of deliberative democracy in our country. So I hope that we can all agree to work together from the very beginning to make our particular contribution a success and a source of pride for all of us. But I hope that it won't all be serious, and that you will also find being part of this process an enjoyable and enriching experience. People who took part in previous assemblies were very enthusiastic about what they themselves got out of the process, and also how they were able to contribute to public policy on critical social issues. And I just want to read you a couple of quotes from previous participants because I found them very, very interesting. One said, "Giving up a few weekends seemed like a small price to pay for the experience and the memories it has given me." Another commented, "With little knowledge of politics or the Constitution, I found it was made very easy for us. I was never made to feel ridiculous and everyone was approachable." Yet another participant said, "It made me realise that my view of the world is just that and is no more right or wrong than the next person's. A great learning experience for me." And a final quote from yet another participant was, "The experience opened my mind and I'm proud to say it was my small part to serve my country." So if we can have that kind of experience, I think we'll all be happy with the investment of time that we're going to make. Now, two people who served on the last assembly are here this afternoon, and they will tell us what it was like and what they got out of it. And they will give you a flavour of what to expect, and you'll have an opportunity to put questions to them as well if you wish. For my part, I want to reassure you that you don't need any specialist knowledge to be part of this assembly. And again, when I looked at what previous participants said were the best parts, they felt that broadening their own knowledge and understanding of the issues through access to quality factual information from experts was a very big part of it. And secondly, that the possibility of discussing the topic and listening to the opinions of people with different views was also very enriching. So those two things will be the hallmark of the way that we will conduct the assembly, because we want you to have a similar experience. And so we will organise to give you factual information and evidence-based research on the key issues we're invited to discuss. On some issues, we'll also invite in advocacy organisations to come and talk to us about the changes and the actions that they would like to see take place. And they will also tell us why they do or do not support certain changes. And on all of the issues, we will have plenty of time for discussions in small groups and all together as an assembly. Now, of course, for the experience to be rewarding for everyone, we will need some ground rules. And the purpose of these rules will be to make sure that everyone is heard and listened to respectfully, no matter how different their views. We have taken the principles followed in the Constitutional Convention and the last Citizens' Assembly. And I'm delighted that we have Tom Arnold and Mary Lafoy here in the front row, the chairs of the previous convention and assembly. They have given me great help and advice in preparing for this assembly, and I want to very sincerely thank them for their generosity and their time. So inspired by what worked under their leadership, we will have 6 basic ground rules to follow at all times. Now you can see them on the panels up here at the front, and I think you might even see them on the screen in a moment. But let me go through them. Yes, here we are. So as you can see, the first principle is that openness. And that means that we're going to work in complete transparency. All of the public sessions, like this one, all of the public sessions of our meetings will be live streamed, and all the documentation that we give to you will also be made available to the public on the Assembly website. However, and this is very important, our discussions in our roundtables will be private. They will just be between us, and they will not be live streamed. So the first principle of openness is followed by fairness. And that means that we will do everything to make sure that the full range of views is heard, and we'll also make sure that our briefing material is of the highest quality. The next principle is equality of voice, and that means that you are all equal. Each of you will have the same opportunity to express your views, again, if you so wish. Then comes efficiency. As you see from the Oireachtas resolution, we will have a lot of issues to discuss. So we will work to make the best use of our time. There'll be plenty of time for discussion, as I said, but it will also be my role to move the discussion along so that we actually do cover all of the issues in the resolution. And any papers that we have for our meetings, you will get them in advance so that you will have time to prepare in whatever way you see best to prepare before our meetings start. The fifth principle, very important one, is respect. And we will always work to make sure we have an atmosphere where everybody feels free to express their opinions, confident to make their contributions, without fear of personal attack or hostile criticism. And finally, the sixth principle is collegiality, and this simply means that we will work together in a spirit of friendship. Many people who are not here today and would like to be and would like to make their views known and follow our work will be able to do so through the live streaming of our meetings, and that means that they will be able to follow us on our journey. We're also launching a public consultation on Monday, inviting any person or organisation with views on achieving greater gender equality in Ireland to send them to us. And this consultation will run from Monday the 27th of January until Friday the 6th of March, and the details are on the website. We'll all get used to quoting it very frequently, so it's www.citizensassembly.ie. I think that's enough for me at this stage. As I said, we're now going to hear from Dr. Evelyn Mahon of Trinity College Dublin on social change in Ireland. She will describe the journey our country has been on in recent decades. And in this assembly, we will be helping to shape the next steps in that journey through our discussions and through the recommendations that we will make. After the live-streamed part of this public session, we will continue in private, where we will give you all the practical information that you're going to need to have in order to take part and to enjoy being members of the Assembly. Our first full weekend session will be on the 15th and 16th of February in Malahide, County Dublin. And I want to conclude by saying that I hope and believe it's going to be a great and worthwhile experience, and I really look forward to sharing it with you. Thank you very much.
Now, before we introduce the next speaker, we're just going to watch a short video about the actual process of the Citizens' Assembly.
Ireland is becoming known as a leader in deliberative democracy.
So far, there has been the Convention on the Constitution between 2012 and 2014.
And between 2016 and 2018, we had the Citizens' Assembly.
And now a new Citizens' Assembly on gender equality has been established by the Oireachtas.
The Assembly is to consider a number of areas in relation to gender equality.
And advance gender equality with proposals in areas such as care, pay, leadership and public life.
The Assembly is made up of 100 members, including the chairperson, Dr. Catherine Day.
The members of the Assembly have been randomly selected from across Ireland.
And together they are broadly representative of Irish society.
The Assembly will hold meetings over a number of months in 2020.
All members will have a say, an equal voice, and be heard.
At the meetings, the Assembly members will get information about the topics they are considering.
Hear from people about their personal experiences.
Hear from experts to help with their discussions.
And will share their views.
The general public and interested bodies can make submissions.
And the Assembly will consider all this information and put forward recommendations.
A final report on these recommendations will then be prepared for the Oireachtas.
Gender equality impacts all our lives.
And everyone will benefit from a more equal society.
More information is available on citizensassembly.ie.
And you can follow the Citizens' Assembly on Twitter and YouTube.
Okay. There'll be a quiz later on to see how much of that you were following, okay? So we know a little bit more about the process now, but it's also important, as Catherine was saying, that as the Assembly begins its work, that we're aware of the broader social and historical context of the issues that you're going to be concerning yourselves with. Over the decades, there have, of course, been many levers of change which have impacted on the lived gender experience in Ireland. Some have advanced gender equality, others have been less positive, shall we say. To develop this further, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Evelyn Mahon, who is going to speak to us a little about social change in Ireland. Dr. Evelyn Mahon was educated in NUIG, the London School of Economics and University of London. She lectured at the University of Limerick until 1991, when she joined the Department of Sociology at Trinity College in Dublin. She has successfully led a number of funded research projects on sensitive health and social research issues, including at EU level. Dr. Mann founded the Master of Science in Applied Social Research in Trinity College in 1997 and remained its director until 2010. She retired as an associate professor in the School of Social Work and Social Policy in 2014, but remains a fellow emerita of the school. A warm welcome, please, for Dr. Evelyn Mann.
Thank you very much. As I've a lot to get through, I won't make any other comments. I'll just get straight in. In this paper, I have basically divided it up into 6 PowerPoints, and I'll take you through almost 70 years of change in Ireland related to gender equality. The starting point of this, as Catherine has mentioned, is this article in the Constitution in which the state recognises, or wanted to recognise, an article, the woman gives the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved. And then they went on to say, the state shall not endeavour to ensure that mothers shall not be obliged by economic necessity to engage in labour to the neglect of their duties in the home. Now, this was part of the family and the way the family was organised in Ireland, the family being the first basic unit of Irish society, and an earlier article actually gives particular protection to the role of the family. Now, it was interesting when you look at that in terms of care, you might well say, well, they should have given money to women to stay at home and do all this duty, but that's not exactly what happened. The way in which that what happened from the Constitution was that they introduced a whole series of laws that actually made people obey the Constitution. As that woman says, maybe the De Valera dislikes and mistrusts us as a sex. Because what happened was a lot of legislation, like the marriage bar, was introduced to stop married women working and married women even returning to work. So it was almost as if women were given a choice. You can be a worker or you can be a mother. That really gave rise to what we call now a male breadwinner housewife model. So the male is the male breadwinner. We don't often talk a lot. We have talked a lot about the dependency of the woman in the home and the task given to her. But there was also the role for men as breadwinner was quite demanding as well, because it brought with it the notion of being a good provider. And in fact, women were encouraged to marry good providers if they wanted to form a family and settle down. And men, in fairness, who didn't make that grade, some of them became later West of Ireland and Seacoast bachelors, and others, for whatever reason, just didn't get married, and they were often not treated in quite the same way. Now, I'll get on to the next one. While there is a lot of, I don't think of this adding in a little bit here. While there is a lot of negative, I suppose, analysis of the role of the Catholic Church, I think one of the most important legacies it left to women was the way it actually provided women with equal opportunities in the level of education. The nuns and priests set up, and brothers, set up schools, many of them primary. The primary ones weren't under the nuns, but under the Catholic, or the local priests. Whereas the secondary schools, as we all know, were run by nuns and Christian brothers. And for women, it meant that women got the same education as men. In fact, they often excelled, which they often still do in terms of their achievements at school. One of the reasons given for it was that women were equal in one sense in the eyes of God because they had a soul. So it was very important to actually make them aware of that, and women really became the educators. They also were the person who actually kind of made sure that the teaching of the church and the behaviour of their children, and sometimes of their husbands, was appropriate and followed the rules of Catholicism. So women really were treated, they were given a major role, and as often people recall, sometimes it's difficult, and I must say this, that to talk about just the new debate on women participating in the labour force and counting the numbers, because any of you know that really what we were talking about in Ireland at that time was a very traditional society. Many people were working on farms, maybe in small lodging houses. So the idea that women didn't work was not true. It was just that they didn't actually participate in a formal labour force as employees. And that's important, I think, to keep registering it, because now the next thing that, in order for women's roles to be, and the role of women to gain equality, it is necessary for them to have opportunities. And one of the big things in Ireland in the 60s was investment in education. And that was important because people were also very interested in the development of third-level education. And there was a lot of emphasis, I think, on, if we could only have so many 100 engineers, Ireland would become a leading industrial giant. It would, become a great country. So there was, in that sense, a lot of emphasis on third level, and third level education itself played a further major role in the opportunities afforded to women. One of the interesting things, and I think one or two women ministers, I recall, I couldn't check it up, that Gemma Hussey realised when she was Minister for Education that, I don't know whether it was the matric papers or the Leaving Cert papers, there was a pink paper for the girls and a blue. So anybody correcting the papers would know whether they were collecting a male or female paper. But in general, education did not discriminate between men and women, because you had to just do your exams and get through it. The same thing happened with entry to third level, and that has come up as a bit of debate from time to time. The meritocratic entry on point system and all the rest of it to Ireland was very, I think, instrumental in making third level education very visible. And in fact, for years, people were almost obsessed by the Leaving Cert and entrance to third level. But it did play a very important role in the emancipation and development of education for women. And particularly, it led to an increasing number of women following professions. And that included what might be called the top professions, such as, for instance, law and medicine. And that, again, was extremely important, because it often, within families even, and I kind of noticed it myself when I was in Limerick, for instance, at that stage, that if a girl got high Leaving Cert points in something, she would be encouraged to do law or be encouraged to do medicine or something that maybe, if there wasn't a competitive system there that proved she was so able, she mightn't have done it. So I think it actually played a very important role in developing women's confidence, and in fact, later on you'll find it presented almost a slight problem, because when we went later on to look at where women were in this paid labour force, we found that quite a high proportion of them were in the professions, because they had gone to college, they went on, got jobs, so they were in the professions, and it often looked as if women had taken over or were taking over the professions. But the basis of that, it meant that when you had a very large cohort of educated women, and they were educated in French and language and literature, so they were very open to the world and read widely in terms of some of the great feminist works that were done, like de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, for instance, was a major book which kind of made, the beginnings of the feminist revolution. And also later on, people like Betty Friedan, who I even think came to Dublin and spoke, they had read her book, The Feminine Mystique. So the educational background of women did encourage that kind of openness to broad intellectual writing on women in Europe and in the United States. Now, however, the other thing is the sexual liberation was quite late in Ireland, but what happened in the 1971, you had the beginnings of the women's movement, as it was then called, the women's liberation movement. And in there, had proposed a manifesto called Chains or Change. And the big media event then, and some of this has come up recently with the passing of Gay Byrne and indeed Marianne Finucane, is that they went on the Late Late Show, which was the place to get heard, and it was chaired. You might see it on one of these programs reeling in the years. So that got major publicity, and that was in 1971. Now, their demands at the time were interesting: equal pay, legal equality in all, because at that stage women weren't allowed to do jury service and things, equal access to education, because there were some that felt that they couldn't do kind of work they couldn't do. Contraception was a very major one, which had long been legalised in the UK. It was illegal here. And the other ones they really focused on were justice for deserted wives, widows, and victims of, violence. So in other words, their focus really initially was on women in the home, married women, because the structure around marriage confined women and really didn't give them, if you didn't have a breadwinner, you really didn't have an economic ability to survive. So the focus was very much related to the positions of women in Ireland, and particularly women who were confined to the home. The other interesting one, actually, which I just put in, was they also demanded one house, one family, which I thought was a strange one. That really didn't get quite the same publicity as the others. Now, after that, there was a kind of a split in the women's movement. One group went on, under Luna Fellon, people would have known about her work, to actually go along the American NOW organization, which said, look, we're not going to change the world, we can change everything, but we can begin to introduce small pieces of legislation gradually over time. So we begin here and we move along steadily. And that became really, it's often called a liberal reformist movement, because really they began to do change where they could, like in women at work, and gradually try and bring about increased equal opportunities for women. The other external influence was, as mentioned there, was set up the UN. Well, in fact, it wasn't just the UN. A group, again, of professional women in Dublin, again aware of the UN and what they were doing for women worldwide, actually persuaded the then Taoiseach, to set up a commission on the status of women in Ireland. And so this ran from 1970 to 1972. And they published, they actually made a very interesting series, again, of recommendations. And I was glad to see, actually, when I was trying to look up the secretary, who was the first woman secretary of the department, Thika Beer, who actually chaired that. And I was delighted to see, you can find it in the history module someplace, so that students are asked to imagine themselves back in that time, see what they think of things, because it's amazingly progressive for the time. But what they wanted there was interesting. They recommended a joint obligation to support the family, for men and women both to be obligated to do the family, co-ownership of the family home, greater security for widows, divorcees and deserted wives. They recommended equality in tax allowances for single and married women. They recommended co-education, access to apprenticeships for women, and an increase in the number of girls taking science and maths. So some things are still repeated now, so it's interesting, women into tech. So they came out of that, a very, I thought, interesting series of proposals. Now, so there was a lot of stuff going on. It was very vibrant at that time, and people wanted change. But needless to say, there was quite a resistance from the Irish state to actually give all these, concede to all of these demands. And again, we had another major part of assistance, I suppose, from the EEC. It was called the European Economic Community then, had a shorter title and it concentrated more on economics rather than the broader agenda the European Union has now. And at that stage, Ireland was still traditional, still beef exporting, very agricultural based, which it often still is. And they wanted to become members of the European Union, or the EC it was called at the time. So they had lots of communications with the Commission, presumably, and such like. And they would only be accepted as members of that European Union if they actually introduced equal pay between men and women, and if they abolished the marriage bar. So they were kind of cut. The state had to either decide to give in to this demand or risk not getting the funds from the common agricultural policy. So I always say that was a very effective mover in getting a whole series of progressive legislation introduced for women. Now, I should say there's more on that in a long paper. Now, there was another, the campaign to legalise contraception, that was always there. And again, it was felt that if a woman cannot control the number of children she has, or nowadays when she has children, well then it was very hard to give them any kind of equality, and particularly give them equality similar to male equality. So contraception was a very basic demand, once particularly the contraceptive pill was invented, for all women. But there was a huge campaign, and again it's quite interesting to read it, and some of you will probably see it in things, by the church to stop contraception. Actually, the church still does not permit contraception, except in terms of formal church teaching. Of course, it's ignored, but that was the case then. So there was a very, very strong campaign against introduction of contraception, and even priests or bishops, when they went to confirmation, often spoke about contraception, which the poor little 8 or 9-year-olds wouldn't know what it was about, but they were addressing the parents. So eventually, that took a long time, but it wasn't really until 1979 that contraception, or bona fide family planning for bona fide family purposes, was introduced in legislation by Haughey. The next, sorry, I'm on the next page. Should be? Yeah. Now, after that, and after those, really, once we joined the European Union, we had to actually kind of shape ourselves up and get stuff done, and the European Union became a big advocate, pressure group, whatever you want to call it, for the advancement of women's rights. And in Ireland, it actually affected two things, and I should have had another slide in there, but I didn't get to put it in, it was time precious. So in the 70s, there was also a huge emphasis on women in politics. So the Women's Political Association was set up, and also, non-familiar, a Women Elect group. Monica Barnes was very involved in all of that, to give financial support to women candidates. And it was very effective, actually, because several women, not only did they become elected, but they went on to play major roles in developing Irish women's rights. So they were very much feminist politicians. Gemma Hussey, for instance, Nuala Fennell, Mary O'Rourke, and Maura Geoghegan-Quinn. Now, Maura Geoghegan-Quinn is a very interesting case because she was First Minister for Justice, but there's a big stories about it, or how he appointed her, very young woman at the time, she was a teacher, to chair the first Oireachtas Committee on Women's Rights. So again, a bit like the group that are organising this, the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Women's Rights sat really from 1984 to 1997, and they produced a rather similar kind of way. They got research funded, they had reports, and they tried to advance. The first one, for instance, in 1984 was on education. The second, a later one in 1987, was on sexual violence. They also went on to do ones on changing attitudes to women in the workplace. So those things were looked at then, and because they were tied up with the civil service, they actually slowly kind of were drip-fed into the kind of whole structure of social change. A bit later on, it kind of became, as the European Union changed, and also the Joint Oireachtas Committee, no longer became quite the same thing, but it did actually develop what was called the Third European Community Action Problem. So you'll find that at that stage, long after that, which was much later, in kind of 92 onwards, it didn't give directives, the European Union, it gave kind of good advice and said what you should ideally be doing to advance the roles of women. In 1990, I was involved with, I did a study, I was interested myself in the study on how the equal opportunities policies that had been introduced affected women in the civil service. And in particular, I was wondering, was there much better recruitment? Were women getting equal opportunities to be promoted, to apply for jobs? And so the Joint Oireachtas Committee gave me some money to actually do the study. And it was subsequently used, in fact, quite effectively, because that's a wonderful thing actually about doing work for government committees. It's going to be read and looked at, and the recommendations gone through with a fine comb, so they're not too radical or too much or whatever. But it was a good system. It's a good system of kind of bringing politics, civil servants, and the public, and all together, and progressing change. It takes a long time, but it gets there in the end. So, but what I found at that stage was that, in terms of equal pay, for instance, one of the big disadvantages of the first kind of equal pay legislation was that it was the rule, and as implemented here, now not the same in all countries, equal pay for women was got if you were in exactly the same job as a male in the same organisation. So it was really, if he was in the same place. So it was very restricted. The reason it was very restricted in its effectiveness, because women didn't work in the same jobs as men. Women were in one job and the men in the other, and that was what we called horizontal segregation. And that really stopped the impact of the equal pay in its more primitive form. The other thing that was coming on the agenda now, because at this stage a lot of the women were in work for quite a bit of time, was what we call vertical segregation. Now, vertical segregation, it's often looked now as a ladder, and if I had another slide, I would have put the ladder, because the vertical segregation is who is at the top of the ladder in terms of the career structure, like who is the secretary of the department, and all of these. So what I found was that, and again, the references to where you can read up all of this, was that really women were getting up a certain amount, up to a certain level, like staff officers was then, but they weren't getting up to the top post. The top post in the civil service still remained male-dominated. Now, they also at that time, so that was, yeah. Now, they also at that time, when I actually interviewed the women who had made it to, if you like, made it to the top, and I did wonderful interviews with fantastic women who had got, maybe if not up to the secretary, but almost. The other thing about it then is worth saying is that the steps on the ladders were much shorter than they are now. Ladders much, much longer. But then it was kind of simple. So what I found is when I interviewed women about how they got to be where they are, I had made it to the top, had broken, you'd call it now the glass ceiling or something. I found out that they really had lived lives where they delayed having children often. They worked, obviously, continuously. But the other thing is they adopted what is called as the male as norm working models. In other words, they worked just as hard. In fact, they worked much harder than the equivalent men. And that was the only way they could get promoted. So they formed a very distinctive group, and that male as norm became a sort of a catch cry and something that people critiqued when they were trying to explain how it was, and they still use it, why women don't get to the top. They have childcare, they have to leave early, they can't go the weekends, etc., etc. Not all of it is quite explained by that, but that's another day. So the civil service at the time also introduced what they called family-friendly initiatives. Now, those family-friendly initiatives were, I remember the most popular one was flexi time. You didn't have to check in at the particular time. You could decide you couldn't come in until 10, which was fantastic for people with children. They also introduced job sharing, which is now kind of part-time work, or you have some of that already, and it maybe called something else, so that you could actually share a job with somebody else, which worked very well for some people in the middle grades. They didn't want to give up work, but they wanted, say, to work 2.5 days a week. And that worked, but the women had to organise it themselves. And the final one was women could get career breaks. It was called career breaks for childcare purposes, and you could take off for 5 years. Now, one of the interesting things about that, not surprisingly, was that the group of women who took those things varied. In other words, the lowest paid women took the career breaks. The middle range were more inclined to, if they wanted to stay in their job sharing. Whereas, so it really was, and in fact, to be quite honest about it, some of the career break, unofficially, I remember some departmental officials saying to me, well, really, we're kind of hoping they won't come back. But it was supposed to be that they would go for a while, but then come back. But many didn't come back, or many came back several years later. So that was where we were at. Now, in 95, there are all sorts of things, as you know, in Ireland going on simultaneously, but there was another study, in fact, a study I was involved with, called Women in Crisis Pregnancy. It was Minister Noonan at the time. He wanted to find out why Irish women were going to Britain for abortions. The lone single mother rate of non-marital births, whatever it's called at the time, was going up, and they wondered what were the factors that led to unmarried pregnancies, and what were the factors that led to crisis pregnancies of such a kind that they went to England for abortion. Now, that study also looked at, it was quite different one, it's a quite a unique study, because it looked at pregnancy and women in the context of, if you got pregnant and you weren't married in this family, what were your options? So the option was to give the child up for adoption, and we've had lots on that. And that went on right at the end of the 70s. There was kind of not the hidden kind, not the more ones that's got a lot of publicity, but a lot of people in their 70s at college, sort of, probably in my time even, who had a baby, wanted to stay on. They would have their child adopted, secretly, privately. Nobody knew anything about it, and that was one solution. The second one was becoming a lone mother, lone parent. And one of the things about that study, it showed really in graphic details the difficulties that a lone mother would have in supporting that child, looking after the child, and looking after the child financially as well. So that was a big concern. And the third one then is, if it was impossible, well, then they would seek an abortion in England. So it really showed the social causes of abortion. And I think revealed, quite unexpectedly maybe, how abortion and choice was quite a difficult choice for women. The other one that was, at the same time then, lone parenthood. In the 90s, they did nothing except studies on lone parenthood. I mean, they did more studies than anything else. Margaret Fine-Davies, a colleague of mine, have done that. But it was trying to get how best to support them. And the broad decision was made, okay, we must support them, we mustn't have them having abortions, so we must give them something like a lone parent allowance. And in fairness, at that stage, Ireland did develop a very progressive, comparatively speaking, economic package for lone parents. So they did get money later on. If they were working, they would get some support for childcare, and they also got housing allowances. So it was considered, and there was no compulsion on them to actually stop being a lone parent. They weren't, when the child is 5, come back in and get a job or something. That happened much later. So Ireland was actually rather good in that financial sense of helping lone parents. The final one there was the father's rights. Now, at that stage, the focus on fathers at that stage was as like bad dads, fathers who don't care, they don't give any money, they won't support children. So there was quite a pressure to get the fathers paying money to support the children. And that was, in terms of, it was their obligations rather than their rights. Because one of the things that I'll mention later on is that fathers didn't get any protection in the Constitution. They were breadwinners. They didn't really, the fatherhood bit didn't kind of come into it, with the result that they didn't have any major rights as fathers. So you ended up then with the development of really an area of mothers as carers and workers. Now, this brought you back then to the childcare debate, because it was found really that, okay, mothers can't continue in work, they can't manage it all, lone mothers need help to mind their children. So you began the whole emphasis on childcare. Now, childcare was being requested since 1970s. The European Union used to do these kind of, they compare and contrast all these countries, and Ireland would be competing with Britain for the least amount of support for childcare for years and years and years. So again, eventually it was, so to speak, tackled in the Commission on the Status of Women, the 1992 Commission status, which was a huge commission, but the major focus on it was on childcare. A very, very extensive debate on it. You can read it up later on. A very extensive debate took place on it. And in fact, it ended up with women divided between each other. In other words, there were one group, it proposed a very organised setting up of a formal childcare system with training, setting up criteria for the employment of people, and a section of a department to progress childcare. But there was dissent, and in particular groups, roughly called Mothers in the Home, objected to that. And they found it rather difficult to accept that the state would be willing to pay other women in childcare settings to mind the children, but the same state wasn't prepared to pay the mothers themselves to stay at home and mind the children. So it was a very big debate. Now, it was very convenient for the government because they kind of more or less said, well, women can't decide themselves what they want, so it was ignored and ignored and ignored. There was a slight, later on they had the Commission on the Family. Now, that's a very interesting one because that was almost set up, and some of the analysis of it, to look at the implications really of the findings of the earlier one. And in particular, that commission has quite a bit, it has a bit on fathers. And there was some suggestion that fathers should be given more rights and fathers' rights should be inscribed. And there was even a proposal that they should have a commission on men. But that wasn't carried through. So really, in other countries, there was the beginning. Now, for instance, there was the beginnings of fathers' rights, but it didn't really, it was slower happening here and didn't come out in quite the same way. Finally, in 2010, the EECE Childcare and Education Scheme was introduced, and most of you will be familiar with that now, where each child, irrespective of their income, gets 15 hours of childcare per week for 38 weeks up to the age of 4, or I think 4.5 or something. So that was introduced. Now, the interesting thing, I think, in the end that brought in the childcare provision, and that's kind of took it over the bar, was at that stage, and that's why the fatherhood became important, was people began to talk about the rights of the child. We had the Child Care Act, but the whole thing, they discovered that obviously earlier childcare, preschool was extremely important for the educational development of children. So that became something that every child should get, not just be available to people who could afford it. So that certainly advanced the legislation and eventually the policies on childcare. The only thing about that was, in comparison to when it was introduced in other countries, it was very much later here. And the kind of full socially funded childcare, public funded childcare was good, that was now available very much in France and Sweden, Denmark, all sorts of places, wasn't on offer here. It was funded, they had huge sections on whether we could afford it, and long reports saying we couldn't, basically. The result of that was, and again the European Union came to our assistance in some way, because they said, well, okay, what we'll do is to set up this and to begin to start this process, we will give you funds for capital expenditure so you can build creches and all the rest of it. And that is actually what happened. So you had the buildings, you had the development of the facilities and the beginnings of training and childcare and all the rest of it. But still, you know, it was means tested, and as you know, the one at the moment is quite complex, and I haven't covered it here. But the main thing about it was that by that time, childcare provision had become a private matter. It was privatised because companies come in and set up childcare, and that actually made it slightly difficult. And also, that is why you have, and I'm sure this is one you will be addressing quite a lot, that should childcare provision be more affordable for men and indeed for women. So fatherhood, as I said, was not mentioned in the fathers didn't get protection in the Constitution. And that's a contrast with the rights of father really were tied up with the rights of marriage. Married fathers had all the rights, but a non-married father was excluded. They weren't in the kind of, they weren't protected. And that has had an effect too on later understanding and positions of men. The biological father, for instance, we often compare ourselves with Sweden. I know I'm dropping down to the last one there, but in Sweden, for years, every child had a father, and there was what you call a putative father. So even when you couldn't have DNA testing or anything like that, in Sweden, they made a male responsible for the child. So that meant that fathers were part of that child's life, part of the arrangement, even though the couples mightn't have been married or anything. So that was introduced all along, biological father. But we didn't have biological fatherhood in Ireland, and that's still a big issue. So that made it quite different, and again, I think probably not delayed it, but we're going to have those debates now. In terms of the kind of breadwinner orientation that men were given in Ireland, there has been some work done now on how men do fatherhood. Can they do fatherhood? Are they permitted? One study done by Jemima Bailey talked about the patriarchal deficit of the constitutional setup, that fathers didn't really have the same freedom and access and encouragement to be involved with childcare and with babies. And she did a very nice study where men were at the births now, they were at home for a while, they bonded with the child, but then often they had to go back to quite extensive work and hours and all the rest of it. Paternity leave, as you know, has only been barely introduced. The other thing is there is some small study, I mean, in fact, one or two I was involved with myself, looking at childcare specifically. Now, we have a lot of stuff on ours, and again, I suspect you'll be getting lots of that in the future. But the other thing was in families, because each family often comes to a different arrangement. You know, you work full-time, I'll work part-time until this and that and the other. So it's really depending on where you're living, have you a commute to work, have you a granny nearby, all of those sort of things really make a difference to the way couples do families. And it's the same way, you know, with men, because they're part of the family. And one of the things certainly that I found is that there are class differences, it seems. Now, the more work needs to be done on this. The question is, do fathers now help out in child, not help out, do their equal share of childcare? Do they take responsibility? Do they, you know, make sure the milk and bread is in the fridge for the following morning? You know, do they telephone, get the childminder? All of these sort of things, the organisational things related to the jobs. And one of the small studies we did show that in Dublin, it was a small study based admittedly on focus groups of women, that women in the lower education groups, so the lower income groups of women, found their husbands and fathers of children helped an awful lot more, did an awful lot more with the child, did an awful lot more with them than was the case, because in fact they didn't have as much paid childcare. So they actually contributed enormously more to doing fatherhood. In the case of the others, women who were higher education, they had actually bought out more childcare. But the one thing that was still very present is the very much longer hours of work that some of the higher income earner men's did. So they were working much longer hours and really weren't allowed. And it was quite, and I think that comes up in other reports, there was quite an unhappiness about, that extensive working culture for men, or husbands, and the actual double burden it actually placed on women and mothers. No, thank you, I'm finished. Copies of the paper, there will be a paper to kind of follow this up, because I know I've tried to cover an awful lot in this. Thank you very much. Right.
And thank you, Evelyn, for that really, really interesting presentation. And a huge job of work to do to compress all those decades of change into what we're asking you to do there. That is the public session now concluded. I'd like to thank all of you who joined us on the live stream and ask you to please join again online to follow the first weekend meeting of the Assembly, which is taking place on the 15th and the 16th of February.